Having spent hours and hours putting it on Keynote, we can't get the cable to work. So I'll get rid of the cable. There we go. I'm over it. So I'm using this, aren't I? Not my... Work out which my controls are. So let's start. Now, I really hope you're awake for this. This is about stylometry, computational stylistics is what the people involved in it call it. And there are going to be a lot of charts and tables and things, and I may have to go quite fast to get in. I've already cut out about a third of what I'd originally written. So let's see what we can do. Anyway, a year ago, we had a lot of headlines, his headlines from the BBC and The Guardian and the New York Times about Marlowe being credited as co-author. And as John Casson mentioned, the claim was that essentially the new tests that have been done could separate Marlowe's style from Shakespeare's style so solidly, so definitely, that it would rule out Marlowe as an authorship candidate. Now, if that's so, I'm absolutely happy to accept that. But as a former scientist, I thought I'd see how solid these things are. So, yeah, if you feel like you're being overwhelmed with tables and figures, believe me, this is just boiled down. This is nothing like the stuff I've been through in putting this together. So, great. Okay, so... as many of you will know, when we talk about the Henry VI plays, we're really talking about 5 plays, because we should include the 2 source plays for the second and third parts of Henry VI. As usual with Shakespeare, we don't actually know when they're written, though for various reasons, scholars think that part 1 was written last. It's thought to be the hairy VJ, Henry VI, that appears in Henslow's diary on the 3rd of March 1592 with NE next to it, which some people say means new. Some people say means it appeared in Newington Butts Theatre. But it was played by Lord Strange's men at the Rose, apparently. The Rose is the theatre associated with Marlowe, and Lord Strange's men, the chief company that he wrote for. It was referenced by Marlowe's friend, Thomas Nash, the same year, 1592. Part 3 was referenced by Robert Greene in Groatsworth of Wit, also in 1592. So we can conclude that all 3 plays were written within Marlowe's acknowledged lifetime. Part 1 wasn't published until it appeared in the first folio in 1623, but the other 2 plays were published in several forms. Neither of them appeared with Shakespeare's name on them in the Stratford man's lifetime. They were not mentioned, for example, by Francis Mears in his 1598 list, quite large list of Shakespeare plays. The first mention of William Shakespeare in relation to these plays was in 1619, when 3 years after the Stratford man's death, The Contention and The True Tragedy were published together by Thomas Pavier as The Whole Contention. The tendency to give one or both of the early plays, parts 2 and 3 to Marlowe, began in 1797. Edmund Malone was inclined to believe that Marlowe was the author of one, if not both, contention plays. This opinion was also held by Hallam, Dyce, Flier, Swinburne and Tucker Brooke. There were those who resisted, especially as the publication of Loney's book in 1920 increased authorship scepticism. At this point, mainstream scholars giving chunks of Shakespeare away began to look dangerous. E.K. Chambers famously spoke out against the disintegrators of Shakespeare in 1924. Alfred W. Pollard, in the introduction to Peter Alexander's Shakespeare's Henry VI and Richard III, writing about that those 4 plays, which form a sort of quadrology, is that how you'd say it? Tetralogy, there we go, thank you. I knew there was a word for it. That wrote that there is force of nature, wrote there is no room for both Shakespeare and Marlowe in any one of the 4 plays, echoing the words of Peter Alexander himself. Yet doubt persisted. John Bakeless, in his 2-volume work on Christopher Marlowe, published in 1942, said he believed that both of those plays, second and third parts of Henry VI, were by Marlowe, revised by Shakespeare for the following reasons. The general characteristics, including the style, the structure, the frequent parallels with canonical Marlowe plays, the appearance of Marlowe's typical vocabulary, the versification, the curious way in which historical facts correctly stated in the contention and true tragedy turn up as slightly warped allusions in Marlowe's admitted work, as if an unconscious memory of what is previously written lingered in the poet's restless brain, said Bakeless. The appearance of Marlowe's habitual self-repetition, the dramatic companies known to have produced the plays, and the general probability arising from the dates at which the plays seem to have been written. So, one of the ways scholars have tried to work out Marlowe's contribution to the Henry VI plays, and indeed to work out if there was one, is through finding measurable aspects of the writer's style. Here's a very early version of a basic stylometric table from Volume 2 of Bakeless's 1942 book on Marlowe. The earliest attempts at stylometry by a physicist called Mendenhall looked for ways of mathematically measuring a writer's style through frequency of words of different word lengths. He was asked, actually commissioned by a Baconian, to find a match between the styles of Shakespeare and Bacon, but accidentally discovered a perfect match between the profiles of Marlowe and Shakespeare. This is in 1901. The solid line here is Marlowe. The dotted line, which you can barely see because they overlay each other, is Shakespeare. And in fact, Peter Ferry, a Marlovian, has extended this work and tested a number of writers of the period, and there is no perfect match like that for any of the others. Well, obviously, that's not sophisticated enough for sophisticated people like us. And anyway, it shows us something most of us don't want to see. So let's complicate things. With the advent of computers and processing power, computer processing power to break down text into their components and crunch the numbers, we have the option to make our analyses somewhat more complex. So I'm just going to give you an idea of some of the things you're going to see shortly. You're going to see this. And you're going to see some normalised WANs, word adjacency networks. I think I could make a quilt out of these. Here's another table that looks quite sciencey, right? And the question I'm going to ask throughout the rest of this talk is stylometry science? As someone whose first degree was biology, I have to tell you that some of what they say is bogus. Shock horror. In the introduction to Hugh Craig and Arthur Kinney's 2009 book, a good book, I recommend it, Shakespeare, Computers and the Mystery of Authorship, for example, they postulate that when writers write, short sections of language are spontaneously produced from an individual and unique linguistic unconscious, which is conditioned by genetic makeup, life experience, and language experience, as well as mood. Now, this is where the PowerPoint changing of my lovely Mac fonts is going to ruin the next effect. The highlight here is meant to fall on genetic makeup, not life experience. Okay? Mess my fonts up. And goodness knows that probably won't be the only issue with this. But as far as I know, there is no gene for vocabulary or diction. There's no genetic basis for my words choice. And if you want to say otherwise, you are going to have to show me the science. Here are 3 tests developed by John Burroughs, very clever man. Delta looks at the most common words used, concentrates on function words. Function words operate grammar, auxiliaries, conjunctions, determiners, particles, prepositions and pronouns with, it, and, she, by. Zeta looks at the words of medium usage and either analyses function words or lexical words, depending on the test. Lexical words are the words that carry meaning, semantic words. Nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, cat, green, thrust, badly, etc. Iota looks at words that are very rarely used, invariably lexical words. You'll also come across PCAs, principal component analysis tests. They're similar to Zeta tests in that they focus on authors using particular words with different frequencies. And there are also those word adjacency networks I showed you a little diagram of earlier, which are more similar in their effect actually to delta tests, partly because they look at function words. I did have a breakdown of, how these are actually calculated, but it took far too long. I had to cut it out. Here we go. Let's have a look at the tests in action anyway. This is from Hugh Craig and Arthur Kinney in a series of stylometric studies published in 2009, which that quote came from earlier, determined that Marlowe had a hand in the first 2 Henry VI plays. And this is how they did it. Craig divided the 3 plays into 2,000-word segments, 10, 12, and 11 segments respectively, and to discover how these segments diverged from Shakespeare's norms. They conducted 2 tests, a PCA test, principal component analysis test, for function words, and a lexical word test. They didn't give that a name. It may well have been something like a zeta test. On the function words, here's some results. This is the first part of Henry VI. Essentially on the function, this is mapping functional against lexical. On function words, to the right of the line means Shakespearean, and on the lexical words, it's above the line, means Shakespearean. So essentially only 2 of the segments fall into the fully Shakespearean quadrant. So essentially it's not that Shakespearean by their 2 sets of tests. Second part of Henry VI, you see that it's part 2 is a little bit more Shakespearean, but still not very much. Part 3 is a bit more Shakespearean again, which is interesting to me. It makes me wonder whether this thing about part 1 being written after the others is actually factual. Still, leave that outside this talk for now. But because actually only 1 is completely non, and it's on the line in this quadrant here, bottom left means really not Shakespearean, they decided to leave that for the purpose of this particular set of tests, and they only looked at 1 and 2. Then they were looking for, focusing on part 1, looking for co-authors. This is how they ruled out Nash. You can see Thomas Nash's prose works are bottom right, and his single surviving play is just below the line drawn between the 2 centroids of the 2 clouds of results. They say centroids a lot. It means the centre of the, sort of mathematical centre of the cloud, as it were. And all 5 acts of part 1 of Henry VI are actually closer to the pre-1600 Shakespeare plays, which is their comparison. I want you to notice, as I take you through these results, that different things are compared in different tests to rule out different authors. I have to suspect, in order to present the desired results, which isn't science, I can tell you. Nash is excluded by comparing his lexical word use with the lexical word use in the 16th century Shakespeare canon. A valid test, and everything is measured by 2,000-word segments, except for Henry VI Part 1, which is split up by acts. Cade is ruled out by a different lexical word test. I'm sorry, it's very faint in terms of the scanning, but those bits down the bottom there, they're Cade, those very faint bits. Yeah, he was, instead of being compared with 16th century Shakespeare play, Cade's word use was compared with that of 134 plays by other authors of the period. So a really big sort of set of things to compare him against. And Henry VI Part 1 is this time split up into 2,000-word segments like the other texts being measured, not acts. Now, I would love to see either of these measures for Marlowe, but that's not what we get. There's no chart, nor even any figures for the complete acts or the complete segments of Henry VI Part 1 when set against Marlowe's canon and Shakespeare's early plays, or when set against Marlowe's canon and the entire play set of the period. Did they not do those tests? Were the results not to their liking? Did they explain them away and discard them? If so, not to worry, because that's just what scientists do, according to a 2004 study of scientists working in their labs by Kevin Dunbar, Jonathan Fugelsang and others, so maybe that is a bit sciencey. Bear in mind as well that this hopping about from method to method to rule different authors out or in has a technical name. That technical name is cherry picking. We'll come back to that. What we get instead of a direct comparison like Cade or Nash to the whole of Henry VI Part 1 is the chart for only the sections that they're prepared to cede to Marlowe. The sections relating to Joan La Pucelle, Joan of Arc, to you and me, based on earlier scholars noticing some Marlovian similarities. So we have no idea, I have no idea if they did any testing against the rest of the play. The dots here are segments from Marlowe's acknowledged canon. You see the dots on the right. These are words, it's mapped with words that playwrights other than Marlowe use more. Okay, so it's like words Marlowe uses more than others against words others use more than Marlowe. So you can see how that one works, hopefully. Yeah, and here are the three Jones sequences in the middle, those shapes. You see, those geometric shapes are the Jones sequences. And as you can see, let's be fair, they fall bang in the middle. I mean, falling almost on the line that separates this test's version of what constitutes Marlowe and not Marlowe. The differentiation, as far as I can see, is really minimal. I want to drill into this test a little bit further. We're not given all the words that were considered Marlovian, but Craig gives us a sample of words that appear in the middle Jones sequence and are also in the top 50 of Marlowe marker words. Here they are. These are the ones that we're given. So in a relatively small corpus of 6 counted plays for Marlowe, one play can create a significant bias. I was wondering whether some of what they call Marlowe's marker words have been derived from a single play in the canon. Hell, for example, obviously used quite a lot in Dr. Faustus. So I did a little research of my own. I conducted a simple word count for the words that Craig listed. The highest count for each word is marked in red, and significant counts, which I've arbitrarily set at double figures, are marked in green. And this is what I've observed about these so-called Marlowe marker words. And you can see this for yourself, really. Genre is critical. The majority of the Marlowe marker words present in the middle Jones section are all about battle and come from the 3 plays, Edward II and the 2 parts of Tamburlaine, that are full of battles. Arms, realm, sword. Joan is at war with the English, so that's pretty understandable. Notice how many of these words are from the 2 Tamburlaine plays, essentially 2 parts of the same story. It's very possible that these are plays closest in time to when Henry VI Part 1 was written. But again, it's much more likely that these words are held in common because these plays are full of battles, and so are the middle Joan scenes. One word which goes across almost the entire Marlowe canon, and I would accept as a genuine Marlowe marker word, it's an obsession, really, with death. All of the plays contain battle, insurrection, massacre and slaughter, with the exception of Dr. Faustus, which nevertheless has some interest in death as it relates to damnation. Every play uses the word slain. These are histories and tragedies, or in the Jew of Malta's case, perhaps a tragic farce. So, of course, they are full of death. Death was picked up as a marker word for Marlowe against, it's really important to see how the marker words are brought out, how they're decided, against 130 single-author non-Marlowe plays, including Johnson's city comedies, Marston's satires, and all kinds of frippery. So you really need to ask, is this the right test? How about comparing Marlowe's historical tragic plays with Shakespeare's historical and tragic plays, and then seeing if death is a marker word? Because it's fair to say that Shakespeare was pretty obsessed with death too. And that's an important issue. We are looking at whether a play section is Marlowe or not Marlowe. We're not looking at that. We are looking at whether it's Marlowe or Shakespeare. So it's between these 2 corpuses that the marker words should surely be decided. Stay is a similar issue here, and it's a cross-genre word. What is Shakespeare's use of stay? If Marlowe was compared with Shakespeare's canon, is it still a marker word? Look also at countries. Countries here. According to Craig and Kinney, countries is in the top 50 of Marlowe marker words, the top 50 out of 500 marker words. Marlowe uses the word countries twice across his entire corpus. Does that mean that other playwrights never use the word countries? Was the error made here despite the methodology professing to use standardised spelling? Because they used the early spelling version of Massacre at Paris and mistakenly counted 4 instances of countries spelt this way, when in fact it would have been modernised to the possessive country apostrophe S. It's a possessive countries. Are countries good? 2 instances of word use in 2 plays across a corpus of 6 plays is surely not a valid, a statistically significant marker word. Discounting Henry VI, Part 2, Shakespeare uses the plural word countries 6 times. This seems a not dissimilar proportion when the size of each corpus is taken into account. And I think I can prove that spelling wasn't standardised as claimed, because it turns out that in Henry VI, Part 1, it doesn't actually contain the plural word countries either. Joan Le Pucelle is using the possessive country apostrophe S. Craig and Kinney cross-check their results for these Joan scenes with function word tests in the form of principal component analyses, or PCAs. But Craig, publishing a paper with Burroughs in 2012, noted that function word tests are also influenced by genre. Tragedy leads to more occurrences of I and my, and comedy to more occurrences of thou and you. And the long speeches in tragedies and histories can lead to more connectives. Hugh Craig detected Marlowe's hand in several parts of Henry VI, Part 2. Most significantly, the Jack Cade scenes, which comprise most of Act 4. They actually pulled them out separately and tested the Jack Cade scenes here. I won't go into detail on the individual tests, but here are the results. And you can see they vary widely. There is broad agreement across all the tests that Marlowe wrote segments 10 and 11, and possibly 9 and 12. Segments 10 and 11 include the Jack Cade scenes, which are separated out at the bottom. Marlowe gets less of the play on lexical word tests, which, as I've explained, is very problematic when it comes to comparisons with Marlowe because of all the genre bias of his surviving core play corpus. But because the comparison set of all, and also because the comparison set of all non-Marlowe plays is too broad. But I want you to look at the, obviously these are the ones that I would cherry pick if I'm going to go for it. Oh yes, Marlowe is a real author. Look at the PCA tests. The PCA function word tests are really interesting because even the narrowest Shakespeare comparison gives the vast majority of the play to Marlowe. And the more the comparison group of Shakespeare's plays is broadened out, the more sections of Henry VI, Part 2 are given to Marlowe in these tests. Compare Marlowe's style with the whole of Shakespeare's canon, and Marlowe appears to have written pretty much the whole play, 11/12 of it. Let's look now at Burrough and Craig's work on the third part of Henry VI, which was published in 2012. They began with some delta tests, function word frequency tests, to determine the set of authors they should be testing against. And they determined that it should be Green, Peel, Marlowe, and Cade. They divided the play up with rolling segmentation. That's 2,000 word segments stepped forward 200 words at a time, making 108 segments in total. That does mean some parts of the play get counted 10 times, essentially. This does allow more of a scene-by-scene impression of possible compositional changes. They compared the delta Z scores, which you don't need to know about. You really don't want to know at this point. It'll take me half an hour for each segment, against the delta Z scores for all of the 54 plays in their set. And they also mapped the combined delta scores for 16 Shakespeare plays, which is the doubled up line at the bottom, 15 plays by the 4 candidates, which is the solid line that goes next to it and crosses it, and 23 plays by the rest of the writers, the dotted line. All the other grey lines are individual plays with delta scores, rolling segmentation. All you need to know about this is that the lines for Shakespeare and for the 4 candidates crisscross, and they see that as indicative of a multi-author play. And you can compare this with the graph for Twelfth Night, doing the same thing. The lines do not cross each other, which they say represents a typical outcome for a single author play. But consider this. There are many lines that do actually cross with Shakespeare's line for this play. And even different groups of plays, if you grouped the plays differently, you would get crossing. Perhaps in the Twelfth Night one, who knows? These delta tests, the tests resulting in these graphs, give them a rough measure and a perception of co-authorship. They then conducted a test that they called iota plus, which they say rests upon an assumption about relative degrees of likelihood that an author who uses a given word even once in a batch of his or her work is somewhat more likely to use it in a fresh text than are other authors whose sample batches it doesn't occur at all. They say that experience is giving increasing weight to the assumption, and the iota plus test is yielding extremely accurate results. They do not actually say how iota plus works, and there are no figures for it, so I can't drill into that one at all. It seems likely to be a marker word test, much like the other one, on rare lexical words instead of more common words. They combined the results of both tests, and they designated all 108 rolling segments of the play. You've remembered which play we're on, right? Oh, I put it at the top, it's fine, part 3, into quartiles, and according to whether each test determined a segment was Shakespearean or not Shakespearean. And from there, they stick with it's Shakespearean, it's not Shakespearean. They then do this third statistical test, dealing in words not previously used in this study. It's a zeta test, which addresses word types that occur with some consistency in one sample batch, but not another. They put all the scenes they'd assigned to Shakespeare into a block, and they broke it into 7, so those black ones, 7 2,000-word segments, and all the ones assigned as non-Shakespeare into they ended up breaking into 4 2,000-word segments. So when these segments are subjected to zeta testing, it appears to show a separation between these two batches of segments. Right? So you can see that fairly clearly. But there is more than one way of looking at a graph. I want you to look at the line up the centre. Okay, imagine the left white square and the right black diamond as outliers. In fact, each of these outliers has the same percentage of non-Shakespeare word types, but there's a range of Shakespearean word types. And everything else, all the segments between the tram lines, have between 20 and 23% Shakespeare word types. The main difference is in the vertical distribution, non-Shakespeare word types. But this is from 12 to 18% in the Shakespeare sections and 18 to 22% in the non-Shakespeare sections. And I want to know, are these differences statistically significant? You can put it on a graph and you can make it look like there's a separation, but I don't know. So let's see how, having established the possibility of co-authorship for this play, they decided to narrow down the candidates. Cade was a front-runner from the Delta test, because you see the Spanish tragedy puts him right at the top. His Spanish tragedy is most like by Delta test.
Sorry about this. I'm not breathing out of prejudice.
Okay. Delta tests are good for giving possibilities of authorship, an estimate of overall text-to-text likeness, but they're genre-sensitive, so that might have a lot to do with it. Cade has a tiny canon, only one firmly established play, so for the zeta test they added Solomon Persisted, which some scholars consider to be his. He's ruled out by a zeta test with single words. Note how the Henry VI segments are all clustered close to the work of others and not to the work of Cade. So why are zeta test results for Cade so different from the delta test results? Because delta doesn't make a pre-selection. It just chooses the most common words, not common in comparison to. Therefore, it looks like Cade's favoured words are just very common words in general. The zeta test results with Marlowe marker words shows far less separation. In fact, I think it would be fair to say it doesn't really show separation. It shows a kind of continuum here. Considerable overlap with both the Shakespeare and the non-Shakespeare segments of Henry VI, Part 3. They then conducted a zeta validation test comparing Marlowe's style with Shakespeare's. Directly, they expanded Marlowe's canon to 7 plays to include Dr. Faustus and Dido, which has previously been excluded as a suspected collaboration. And they compared it with Shakespeare pre-1600 canon, minus the comedies, leaving them with 8 plays, 6 histories, and 2 tragedies. They identified 1,000 words favoured more by Shakespeare than Marlowe, and 1,000 words favoured more by Marlowe than Shakespeare, using these 2 sets of plays, doing a zeta test on rolling segments, 2,000-word segments. Now, we've already looked at some of the issues that might come up with Marlowe marker words, so do bear that in mind. But let's look at these results. Results for 7 randomly chosen pre-1600, sorry, it's a bit blurry, 1600 Shakespeare plays suggests that zeta testing for Shakespeare is very reliable. Only 1 segment out of 666 wasn't identified as Shakespeare's. That's a 99.9% success rate. It was far less reliable for Marlowe's canon, an 83.1% success rate, brought down not by the suspected collaboration Dido, which is 100% Marlowe's, according to this test, but what they described as the spectacular failure of the Jew of Malta. Just under 35.8% of it was identified as Marlowe. They explain this in the following manner. The test can be deceived by a play like The Jew of Malta, which evidently departs from the Marlowe style as represented by the other 6 plays, and which might be regarded as more confessional, more farcical, and more comic than they are, though still Marlovian. And yet, if departure from usual style were the case, why were Love's Labours Lost and The Taming of the Shrew, both comedies, identified as 100% Shakespeare when the baseline Shakespeare subset specifically excluded comedies? There are other ways of explaining this data. It could be the difference between a writer still developing versus a writer in mid-career. And how the data is presented really matters. This is the original table. Note it doesn't show percentages for individual plays. The plays are listed in a random order. Why not put the 2 Tamburlaine plays together, for example? Also, it doesn't highlight the fact that if a segment isn't attributed to Marlowe, it's attributed to Shakespeare. Here are the same figures in the same order, but with the columns added for the number of segments identified as Shakespeare's and a percentage column for each author. So it's not just that The Jew of Malta is identified as 36% Marlowe and the rest by authors unknown. It's identified as 64% Shakespeare. What about the ordering? This is the same table arranged in ascending order with percentage of segments identified as Shakespeare. And interestingly, this is reasonably in line with datings as far as we can ascertain them. Certainly, Dido and the 2 Tamburlaine plays are thought to be Marlowe's 3 earliest works. The Jew of Malta is certainly one of his later plays, performed in January 1592 with Henslow's N.E. beside it. What happens if we put the only Shakespeare play of the 7 tested that has a Marlowe segment on the table? Dating is uncertain across both canons, but we have an early performance date of 1594 for a comedy of errors, i.e. 2 years after the first performance of The Jew of Malta. What I'd like to know is, where would Titus Andronicus fall if it was tested in this manner, setting aside the sections supposedly given to Peel? I'm having a stab here at where I think it might go. What about the text in question, Henry VI, Part 3 itself? Slotted in, the early octavo text, True Tragedy, falls right here on the table according to percentages. Now let's put in some dates. The date for Dr. Faustus is derived from the reference in Green's Menaphon to fantastical scholars, bred of Merlin's race, who set the end of scholarism in an English blank verse, a clear hand wave at Faustus's divinity adieu. Henry VI, Part 3 and The Jew of Malta may both have been written in 1591, but both are first referenced in 1592. You'll see that just from arranging it in percentage order, it's also in date order for all of those plays that we have dates for. So you can see here, if you wish, the stylistic transformation of Marlowe into Shakespeare. That Marlowe and Shakespeare are on a continuum with regards to stylistic features has already been shown by Peter Ferry. In his Hoffman Prize-winning essay, A Deception in Deptford, he showed, using Gary Taylor's function word tests, how function words favoured by Marlowe and function words favoured by Shakespeare changed in a smooth curve across the combined canon. The same was true of an earlier stylometric measure run on lines plus feminine endings as a percentage of lines of verse. So the question is, do we really know what we're looking at? What if what we're looking at is a continuum? A continuum that would actually explain the Jew of Malta result. and would also explain why A Comedy of Errors and The Taming of the Shrew show as 98 and 100% Shakespearean, set against a Shakespearean baseline that includes only tragedies and histories. Let's now look at the work of Segarra and others on word adjacency networks, published in Shakespeare Quarterly last year. This was the work, according to Gary Taylor, quoted in an article in the New Yorker, that convinced the editorial board to give Marlowe a co-authorship credit on all three Henry VI plays in the new Oxford Shakespeare, because it seems to separate them out so completely. It's based on how predictably one word will occur within 5 words of another, which is believed to vary in significant ways between authors. The two diagrams. Have we got them? No. Oh, is it go back? Okay, sorry, I'm not really paying full attention. The two diagrams were constructed for the 4 function words for 2 extracts, one from Hamlet and one from Pseudo-Science. This is based on the work of Claude Shannon, the founder of information theory, who in 1951 looked at the predictability of English prose, how predictably one letter would be followed by another particular letter. U after Q, for example, is fairly predictable. He concluded that English prose was about 75% redundant. They give that example of that thing you used to read on the tube, you know, if you can read this, you can and get a good job. That one, with no vowels in it. The thing is, can the predictability of whether one particular word will follow shortly after another word, you know, can you take this method and change it to words? Because the words of a play are not 75% redundant. Can this actually be used as an attribution tool? Well, obviously they're claiming that it can, with quite a high rate of success, so they say. In the word adjacency network test, predictability is compared with its opposite, unpredictability, or they use the word entropy. The entropy of texts, which is very scientific, are measured in centinats, which is really, really scientific as well, isn't it? Centinats. It's good to have a new sort of measure. The authors say they admit that these tests are fallible. They sometimes misclassify plays, but they claim success rates of 93.6% on both the whole plays and acts. They don't show their workings, however, and so it's sent to the back of the class. If I can't check them, I don't really believe it. It does sound impressive, but we really should look at their results on the Henry VI plays. The authors state in their paper that the higher the relative entropy, the less like an author's work the test text is. So a relative entropy of 0, they say, means it's no more or less like an author's work than it is to the work of all the other authors combined. Only a negative relative entropy can be read as having some similarity to the author's work. See in this first graph, mapping the relative entropies of various authors against the 5 acts of Henry VI, Part 1, how Shakespeare is the clear winner, apart from the fact that he's running along 0, so that his work actually isn't more like it than anyone else's. I say just there in Act 4 that there's a slight tendency to be, he's a bit more like himself, as it were. But yeah, they don't mention the fact that it's a 0 score. They say that the 0 score here as well is because there must be someone else that they're not measuring for, like Nash, who might be involved, but Nash can't be tested because they don't have a play corpus for Nash, just the one play, Summer's Last Will and Testament. What they don't consider is that their test might actually be an inadequate measure of authorship. Only Acts 4 and 5 are negative at all for Shakespeare. At what point is a score meaningful or significant? Is a score of less than -1 a significant likeness? Or does a significant likeness start at -2 or -5? Note these results are very different to the results that Craig and Kinney got using different methods. These results show Marlowe's work being essentially unlike, Marlowe is the red line, essentially unlike this play, positive scores, whereas Craig and Kinney give him authorship of significant chunks of the play. Averaged out, the similarity of Marlowe's style to this play looks much the same as Jonson's. Jonson, who's got the same chance of writing it in Act 1 as Shakespeare has, 0. But Johnson's work has never been considered similar to Shakespeare's, whereas Marlowe's consistently has by dozens of scholars for more than 200 years. So again, how meaningful is this measure? When they do a scene-level analysis, and they've admitted that their scene-level analysis isn't as reliable as their act-level analysis, and I'm not frankly sure how reliable their act-level analysis is, they do give some scenes to Marlowe. The authors say that these results broadly agree with Hugh Craig's determination, but they actually disagree more than they agree. They disagree on 5 scenes and they only agree on 4. So that's a false claim. And the differences do not disappointingly lead the authors to consider the accuracy of either method. In an act-level analysis of the second part of Henry VI, Act 1 is strongly Marlowe. They give Acts 2 to 5 to Shakespeare, even though... Oh, is it gone? That's not 2, is it? Okay. Act 5 is strongly Marlowe. And they give Acts 2 to 5 to Shakespeare, even though on Act 4 both of the points are very close indeed and surely too close to call. Also, again, they ignore what they said in Introduction to Paper, that a score of 0 makes it no more like that author's work than any others, with the exception of Act 1, where Shakespeare is still not as like it as Marlowe, not even as similar to it as Peele's. It's the other line in there. Shakespeare is bouncing around 0 again, which makes you wonder about the Shakespeare corpus and its tendency to come out as average in these and other tests, something that was noted by Burroughs and Craig in 2012. Act 4 is significant because it contains almost all of the Jack Cade rebellion. Now, they state, except for Act 4, Scene 10, our method cannot clearly distinguish between Marlowe and Shakespeare in this part of the play. They say, again, that it's similar, that it's broadly agreeing with other results. But in fact, Craig has given you saw the other tests that Craig gave, that section in Act 4, a huge part of it, the Jack Cade scenes, to Marlowe. And in fact, they say that the segment from 4.3 to 4.9 contains almost all the Jack Cade rebellion. That word almost is quite critical because actually they're failing to mention that the Jack Cade scenes begin at 4.2. And as Craig recognises, this is where the Cade scenes start. Unlike Craig, the majority of their tests gave 4.2 to Marlowe. They gave this to, there it is at the bottom. They gave this one to Shakespeare. Now, I could go into their figures on Henry VI, Part 3, but I think we've seen enough of the word adjacency networks. Okay, because what I really want to look at is this Jack Cade scene, 4.2. We do actually have other grounds, and something related to my own personal research, aside from Craig and Kinney's work for attributing 4.2 to Marlowe. Where in Hall's Chronicles, the play's main source, Jack Cade is described as an Irishman, in scene 4.2, he's described as a headstrong Kentishman, John Cade of Ashford. Kent was Marlowe's home county. One of the main secondary characters in the Jack Cade scenes is Dick, the butcher of Ashford. And Dick, the butcher of Ashford, talking about Jack Cade of Ashford, says his father never had a house but the cage. In my copy of the play, this is glossed as a pen, a lockup, a small prison compound, and that is indeed correct. But what hasn't been noticed by any of Shakespeare's editors that I can ascertain is that the cage in the early octavo and folio text is capitalised. And as Richard Rowe worked out when looking at other plays, this usually points to a specific place. So it got me wondering whether there was somewhere in Ashford called the Cage. And indeed, there is. This was the position of the cage in Ashford as documented in W.R. Bristol's article, The Ashford Cage, published in an archaeological journal in 1984. All the following photographs and diagrams are from that article. By the 19th century, this is what the building looked like. But in 1602, it was the market hall. The cage was a tiny lockup under the market hall, a drunk tank, a holding pen for anyone of unruly behaviour. And here are two more drawings showing the cellars and the tiny dimensions of the cage, which was 8 foot long, 4 foot wide and 6 foot in height. Such specific local knowledge of the Ashford Cage, and the central figure, Jack Cade, transformed into a man from Ashford in Kent, quite at odds with the sources, points towards Marlowe as the author of this particular scene, in line with Craig and Kinney's function word tests. And we really must question any methodology that says otherwise. I'm going to wrap up with a summary of some of the problems with the stylometric methods we've been looking at. It's very slow because my transition didn't work like that. It was much better. So, scene size. Sorry, should I go back there? Scene size. Sample size. Word adjacency networks do scene size. They actually have sample size. Some of them are scene size. Some scenes in the 3 Henry VI plays are as small as 105 words. It's unlikely that there is any accuracy at this level. The authors admit accuracy drops at scene level, but there are no independent tests. Now, John Burroughs, whether he's working with Hugh Craig or Ralph Kinney, tends to use 2,000-word segments, either independently or with rolling segmentation. I want to introduce you to a lovely guy called Maciej Eder. He's on Twitter as well. I spoke to him yesterday on Twitter. Maciej Eder is director of the Institute of Polish Language at the Polish Academy of Sciences and founder of the Computational Stylistic Group, a cross-institutional research team focused on computer-assisted text analysis, stylometry, and authorship attribution. And he's done his own independent testing on the reliability of Burroughs' delta and zeta tests. Eder says it becomes quite obvious that samples shorter than 5,000 words provide a poor guessing because they can be immensely affected by random noise. Below the size of 3,000 words, I have to wait for it because it's slower than on mine as well. The obtained results are simply disastrous. Just pause. 2,000 word segmentation on all of the tests I've shown you, maximum. Below 3,000 words, simply disastrous. So here I'm going, look, they're showing that Marlowe's written all the plays. But hey, these results are not appropriate sample sizes anyway, so does that invalidate everything? There is a real issue here because it's very hard for them to pull out the kind of sample sizes that would be large enough because the plays aren't long enough to do that. Okay, so sample size obviously an issue. Influence of genre is an issue. Lexical word tests and even function word tests are influenced by genre. Cherry picking. Like is often not compared with like. Experimenters appear to be using methodologies that give them the best results, the results that they want or expect. The averageness and the homogeneity of Shakespeare compared with other texts has been noticed but not explained. And I think there is clearly an issue here. Something else other than author style is being measured, and I'd be really interested to know what that is. Different methods yield conflicting results. You can see the difference between the PCA tests and the function word tests, even with one particular group of experimenters, or between Craig and Kinney's results and the word adjacency network tests. Lack of independent testing or controls. Control experiments are often run, but they're not necessarily the right controls, and they're certainly not independent. I'd be really interested to know, actually, if you could do things like double-blind tests or randomised controlled trials with this kind of data. That might get us closer to real science. As it is, the experimenter always knows the source of the text they're testing, and they know what they're looking for. And that's not science, actually, as science itself has taught us. Eder has pointed out that there is this avoidance of machine learning methods which exist. They would take human bias and human error out of the equation. Humanities scholars don't use them or haven't used them so far. And then there's the usual issues associated with analysis of early modern plays. Reliable sample sizes are more or less impossible. The very variable state of the text. You're comparing the highly edited first folio plays with mangled possible reconstructions like Marlowe's A Massacre at Paris. There's uncertainty about authorship, how single-authored are the core texts, really, especially as they continue to be broken up and disintegrated. And then we have all the assumptions, both acknowledged and unacknowledged assumptions. In the new Oxford Shakespeare, for example, Craig and Burroughs list a few of their assumptions, that any revisions made did not affect the underlying author's style, for example, that writers worked on discrete scenes and separately. There are also unconscious acknowledged assumptions. The writer's style remains consistent over time. As a writer, I will tell you, not so. The assumption that Marlowe and Shakespeare are actually separate writers with discrete canons will have an even more profound effect on experiment design and on the interpretation of results. So these methodologies are a long way from being truly scientific, and the assumptions that lie behind them are not necessarily correct. The assumption that revision by a later hand doesn't affect the underlying style is a particularly false one, and it needs independent testing. It's clear, for example, that what we know of Raymond Carver's prose style is significantly created by the editing of Gordon Lish. Equally, the style of a piece can be altered significantly by the same author coming back to edit their own work years later. Style is not static. None of these studies mention the work of Merriam and Matthews, whose 1994 Neural Computation in Stylometry 2, an application to the works of Shakespeare and Marlowe. They looked at Tucker Brooks' hypothesis, the one supported by Bakeless, that the Henry VI plays were originally by Marlowe and then revised by the person we call Shakespeare. Their test breaking the third part of Henry VI into its tragic and non-tragic components puts the tragic parts in Marlowe's camp and the non-tragic part in Shakespeare's. Their results clearly show the continuum between one canon and the other that we've seen in other test results. Notice here that their tests also marked The Jew of Malta right up there as a very Shakespearean play. Naturally, the idea that Marlowe and Shakespeare were the same person wasn't considered. But if you test a single author's canon in the same manner, as has in fact been done with Henry James, this is the kind of graph that you see. Marlowe's co-authorship credit across these plays is well earned. It hasn't ruled him out as the possible author of the rest of the canon. But what would happen if Marlowe and Shakespeare's texts were tested in a double-blind experiment with better controls and the results arranged in likely playdate order? What would happen if we tested the evolution of author style in a combined single canon? Those are the results I would be really interested to see. Thank you.